In the final decades of the 19th century, Chicago was a city struggling to reinvent itself. Smoke from factories hung heavy in the air, trains screamed across iron tracks, and thousands of people poured into the streets every day searching for work, hope, and a new beginning. The city had burned once before, and now it was rebuilding faster than anyone thought possible. Opportunity lived in every shadow, and danger hid just as easily. It was the perfect place for a man who wanted to disappear and become someone else. That man arrived under the name Dr. Henry Howard Holmes. No one knew much about his past, and few thought to ask. Holmes had a way of speaking that made questions feel unnecessary. His voice was calm and smooth, and his words always seemed carefully chosen. He dressed well, carried himself like a gentleman, and introduced himself as a trained doctor with experience in medicine and business. In a city overflowing with strangers, Holmes blended in perfectly, yet somehow stood out at the same time. He rented a small room at first and began working at a local pharmacy. The owner, an elderly woman, trusted him quickly. Holmes was polite, intelligent, and eager to help. Customers liked him. He remembered names, asked about families, and listened closely. When the old woman became ill and later passed away, Holmes offered to buy the pharmacy from her relatives. The paperwork was confusing, the payments unclear, but by the time anyone questioned it, Holmes was already the owner. That pharmacy would become the foundation of something far darker. Behind the shop stood an empty lot. Holmes announced plans to build a large structure there, something that would serve as housing for visitors expected to arrive for the upcoming World's Fair. Chicago officials were eager to approve construction, and Holmes seemed like the perfect businessman to invest in the growing city. He hired crews, ordered materials, and began building what appeared to be a 3-story hotel. But from the very beginning, something was wrong. Workers noticed Holmes constantly changing his instructions. One day a wall would be built, the next day torn down. Staircases were added, then removed. Doors were installed and later sealed shut. He hired different contractors for different sections, making sure no one ever saw the full layout of the building. When workers asked questions, Holmes dismissed them with a smile or fired them without explanation. Some assumed he was simply difficult. Others thought he was hiding financial trouble. No one imagined the truth. Holmes himself supervised the construction closely. He studied every hallway, every room, every angle. He walked through the building at night, alone, memorizing its shape like a puzzle only he could solve. To him, the structure was not just a hotel. It was a machine. And every machine needs control. As the building rose, Holmes' reputation in the neighborhood grew. He was known as a polite man, generous at times, and deeply involved in his work. He spoke excitedly about the World's Fair, predicting that millions would visit Chicago. He said his hotel would be a safe and affordable place for travelers, especially young women arriving alone to work or explore the city. Those words carried weight. For many women, Chicago was both exciting and terrifying. Jobs were available, but safety was never guaranteed. A clean room offered by a well-spoken doctor felt like protection in a dangerous world. Holmes understood this better than anyone. Inside the building, rooms began to take shape. Some were ordinary, with beds and simple furniture. Others were strange. They had thick walls, no windows, or locks on the outside. Some doors led to narrow passages hidden behind shelves or cabinets. Holmes kept keys on him at all times and never allowed guests to wander freely. When questioned, he explained that he valued privacy and security. As construction neared completion, Holmes placed advertisements for lodging. People began arriving almost immediately. Travelers, workers, and young women filled the rooms, grateful for affordable housing close to the city center. Holmes greeted them personally, offering friendly smiles and reassuring words. But not everyone who entered the building would ever leave. Neighbors noticed strange patterns. Guests checked in, but no one saw them check out. Holmes explained their absence by saying they left suddenly or returned home. In a city full of movement, such explanations were believable. People vanished all the time. Holmes himself seemed untouched by worry. He expanded his business, opened additional offices, and spoke confidently about future plans. He courted several women at once, promising love, marriage, and stability. To each one, He presented a different version of himself, tailored perfectly to what they wanted to hear. Behind his charm lived something cold. Holmes viewed people not as individuals but as opportunities. He studied behavior the way a scientist studies insects. Who trusted easily? Who had family? Who would be missed? And who would not? As the World's Fair approached, Chicago grew even busier. Streets overflowed with visitors, and Holmes' building filled quickly. The sound of laughter and footsteps echoed through hallways during the day, while at night, silence returned. Inside those walls, Holmes was always awake. He listened. He watched. He learned. The building had begun to serve its true purpose, though no one else could see it yet. It was a place where rules no longer applied, where doors closed without explanation, and where control belonged to a single man. To the city of Chicago, H. Holmes was a successful doctor and entrepreneur. To his guests, he was a kind landlord offering safety in an unfamiliar place. But behind locked doors and hidden passages, something else was forming. Something patient. Something calculating. And chapter one of America's darkest stories had only just begun. As the doors of Holmes' building continued to open to the public, the structure itself seemed to take on a life of its own. From the outside, it looked ordinary, even welcoming. Brick walls rose neatly above the street, windows reflected the busy Chicago sidewalks, and the drugstore below bustled with customers. But inside, the building obeyed no rules of normal design. It was not made for comfort or convenience. It was made for secrecy. Guests noticed the strangeness almost immediately, though few spoke of it aloud. Some hallways narrowed without warning, forcing people to turn sideways to pass. Others ended abruptly at locked doors that Holmes claimed led to storage rooms. Staircases twisted upward only to stop at ceilings, while other stairs led down to dark spaces no guest was allowed to enter. Holmes explained these oddities with jokes about poor planning or changing ideas. He said the building was still under improvement. Most accepted his explanations. After all, Holmes was the owner, and he always seemed to know exactly where he was going. What no one realized was that Holmes had memorized every inch of the structure. He knew which boards creaked and which stayed silent. He knew how sound traveled through the walls and where shadows gathered at night. The building was designed so that he could move unseen, slipping through narrow passages hidden behind walls, shelves, and mirrors. From these secret routes, he could observe his guests without ever being noticed. Some rooms were built with thick iron plates behind the walls, making them nearly soundproof. Cries, if they happened, would not travel far. Other rooms were sealed tightly, with gas pipes installed behind the walls. These pipes connected to a central control point, where Holmes could turn a valve and slowly release poison into a room. He could listen as breathing changed, slowed, and eventually stopped. To Holmes, this was not cruelty. It was control. The basement beneath the building was the darkest part of all. Holmes never allowed anyone down there. He claimed it was unsafe, filled with machinery and chemicals for business purposes. In truth, the basement was where evidence disappeared. Large vats of acid stood against the walls. Pits of quicklime waited to dissolve flesh. A heavy furnace burned hot enough to destroy bones. Holmes had studied anatomy and chemistry carefully. He knew how to dismantle a human body piece by piece, leaving little behind. What remained, he sold. Medical schools at the time desperately needed skeletons for study. Holmes provided them clean, labeled specimens, and collected payment without questions. To the buyers, he was a professional supplier. To the victims, he was their final destination. Above the basement, life appeared normal. Guests came and went. The drugstore operated daily. Holmes smiled, laughed, and spoke kindly to everyone. He remembered birthdays, offered loans, and presented himself as a man of generosity and care. One of those who trusted him was a young woman named Julia. She worked in the drugstore and grew close to Holmes over time. He listened to her worries and promised her a better future. He spoke of marriage and a life together. Julia believed him completely. She ignored rumors, dismissed strange feelings, and placed her trust in his hands. One night, Julia entered the building and was never seen again. When coworkers asked about her, Holmes calmly explained that she had left town. He said she was tired of the city and wanted to start fresh elsewhere. No one questioned him closely. People came and went from Chicago every day. But deep below the building, the truth rested in silence. As months passed, others disappeared as well. Some were guests. Some were employees. Some were women who had trusted Holmes enough to let their guard down. Each disappearance followed the same pattern. Holmes provided a reasonable explanation, and the city moved on. The building itself helped him hide the truth. Rooms could be sealed off and reproposed overnight. Walls could be closed. Evidence could vanish before morning. Holmes was always one step ahead, adjusting his methods whenever he sensed attention or suspicion. Neighbors occasionally noticed strange smells drifting from the building. Holmes explained them as chemical experiments or plumbing issues. The explanations were strange, but they fit his image as a doctor. In an age when science was still mysterious to many, people rarely challenged someone who spoke with authority. At night, the building became eerily quiet. Lamps dimmed. Doors locked. Holmes walked the halls alone, listening to the silence he had designed. To him, the building was not just a tool. It was a reflection of his mind. Complicated, hidden, and controlled. The World's Fair arrived, bringing millions to Chicago. Holmes' building filled to capacity. Guests arrived exhausted from travel, unaware that they had stepped into a place designed to erase them. The noise of the city covered everything. Disappearances blended into the chaos of crowds and constant movement. Holmes thrived during this time. He made money from rent, from insurance schemes, and from selling remains. His confidence grew with every crime that went unnoticed. He believed himself untouchable, smarter than everyone around him. But with each passing day, the building held more secrets than it could hide forever. People began to talk, quietly at first. A clerk mentioned how many guests never returned for their belongings. A neighbor wondered why certain rooms were never cleaned. A supplier questioned how Holmes seemed to need so much chemical equipment. Nothing was enough to bring authorities to his door. Yet, Holmes sensed the shift. He was not careless, but he was observant. He noticed the longer looks, the hesitant questions, the slight changes in tone. He adjusted his behavior, spreading his attention across multiple cities and creating new identities beyond Chicago. Still, the building remained his center, his fortress. Inside those walls, Holmes believed he had perfected the art of disappearance. People entered his world and simply ceased to exist. Names vanished. Stories ended. But no structure, no matter how carefully designed, can contain the truth forever. The house that watched everything was slowly becoming a house that could not keep all its secrets. By the time Holmes left Chicago more frequently, his crimes had begun to change in nature. The building had given him power, secrecy, and confidence, but Holmes was not satisfied with silence alone. Control was no longer enough. He wanted profit, and he wanted it in a way that felt clever, clean, and far removed from suspicion. Murder to Holmes was not an act of rage or impulse. It was a transaction, and insurance would become his most dangerous weapon. Holmes understood people, but more importantly, he understood systems. He knew how paperwork could hide truth, how signatures could create lies that looked legal, and how institutions trusted documents more than instincts. Insurance companies were booming during this period, promising security to families and peace of mind to workers. Holmes saw something else entirely. He saw numbers, loopholes, and opportunity. He began encouraging those close to him to take out life insurance policies. Friends, employees, and business partners were convinced it was a smart decision. Holmes spoke like a man who cared about their futures. He explained benefits, reassured fears, and offered to help with paperwork. He even paid some of the premiums himself, insisting it was an act of kindness. What he never emphasized was that he often named himself as the beneficiary. At first, these arrangements did not raise suspicion. Holmes was trusted. He was educated. He was helpful. People believed he was simply a responsible businessman protecting his interests. In reality, he was setting traps, carefully choosing who would be worth more dead than alive. One of the most tragic figures to enter Holmes' world was Benjamin Petezel. Petezel was not wealthy or powerful. He was a carpenter, a laborer, and a man eager to improve his life. Holmes saw him as loyal, desperate, and easily persuaded. They formed a partnership, though it was never equal. Holmes gave orders. Petezel followed. Holmes proposed an idea that sounded harmless, even clever. Petezel would fake his death. A staged accident. The insurance company would pay out, and the money would be split between them. Holmes promised no one would get hurt. He said he had planned everything perfectly. Petezel trusted him. The insurance policy was taken out. The beneficiary was listed. Every detail was prepared. Holmes told Petezel to meet him in Philadelphia, where the plan would take place. There was no fake death. Holmes killed Petezel without hesitation. He used chemicals, fire, and deception to make the scene look accidental. Then he calmly contacted the insurance company and began the process of collecting the payout. To Holmes, the plan had worked flawlessly. But he made a mistake. Petezel had a family, children, and Holmes believed he could use them as easily as he had used their father. He told Petezel's wife that her husband was hiding temporarily and that the insurance plan required secrecy. He claimed he would take care of the children while arrangements were made. Confused, grieving, and desperate, she believed him. Holmes took 3 of Petezel's children and began traveling across the country. What followed was a slow, calculated series of murders that revealed just how detached Holmes had become from reality. Each child was killed separately, in different locations, using different methods. Holmes rented rooms under false names. He wrote letters to the children's mother, pretending they were alive and well. He moved constantly, staying just ahead of suspicion. To the outside world, he appeared to be a caretaker. To the children, he was the last person they ever trusted. These crimes were different from those committed in Chicago. There were no hidden rooms or secret passages. Holmes had no fortress to protect him. He relied entirely on lies, paperwork, and the assumption that no one was watching closely. But someone was. Insurance companies were careful with money. When the claim for Petezel's death was filed, small details did not line up. Dates conflicted. Witness statements felt rehearsed. Holmes' involvement raised quiet concern. The company hired a private investigator named Frank Gier to look into the case. Gier was not looking for a serial killer. He was looking for fraud. He began following Holmes' trail across states, examining hotel registers, train tickets, and letters. What he found was disturbing. Holmes had traveled constantly. Children had been seen with him and then vanished. Locations connected in ways that made no sense for a grieving family man. Gier's investigation became darker with each step. He uncovered graves, burned remains, evidence that pointed not just to fraud, but to murder. Holmes, meanwhile, grew careless. Success had fed his ego. He believed himself untouchable, smarter than law enforcement, smarter than insurance investigators, smarter than everyone. He boasted about his intelligence and joked about the law catching up to him. He enjoyed the game. But games end. Holmes was arrested, initially for insurance fraud. Even in custody, he remained confident. He smiled for photographs. He chatted with guards. He believed he could talk his way out of anything, just as he always had. What he did not realize was that the walls were closing in. Gier's findings shocked authorities. When the truth about the children surfaced, public interest exploded. Journalists followed every development. Holmes' name spread across newspapers nationwide. The charming doctor from Chicago was now a suspect in something far worse than fraud. As investigators turned their attention back to Chicago, the building Holmes had left behind began to draw interest. Reports of disappearances resurfaced. Witnesses came forward. Former employees spoke of strange rooms and locked doors. Neighbors remembered smells and sounds they had ignored. The insurance game had exposed the pattern. Holmes' crimes were not random. They were deliberate, calculated, and fueled by profit. He killed because it benefited him, because he could. And now, the system he thought he had mastered was dismantling him piece by piece. The man who believed paperwork could protect him was learning a brutal truth. Documents could create lies, but they could also reveal them. Trails that seemed invisible could be followed. And even the most careful predator leaves marks behind. Holmes had stepped beyond his castle, and in doing so, he had given the world something it desperately needed. A way to see him clearly. When H. Holmes was finally taken into custody, the man the public expected to see never appeared. There was no panic, no desperate pleading, no visible fay. Instead, Holmes walked into his cell with the same calm confidence he had shown while walking the halls of his building in Chicago. To him, this was not the end of the story. It was simply another stage where he could perform. At first, the charges against him seemed almost ordinary compared to what he had done. Insurance fraud, financial deception, paper crimes. Holmes treated them like inconveniences. He joked with guards, read newspapers, and spoke politely with anyone who came to question him. He believed the law was slow, clumsy, and easy to confuse. And for a while, it seemed like he might be right. Holmes enjoyed attention. He always had. Prison did not change that. If anything, it gave him a larger audience. Reporters began requesting interviews, drawn by rumors surrounding his past. Holmes welcomed them. He spoke openly, carefully shaping his words to make himself sound clever, misunderstood, even admirable. He described himself as a man with a complex mind, someone ahead of his time. When asked about missing people, he smiled and denied everything. As investigators gathered evidence, Holmes began to shift his strategy. He realized denial alone would not be enough. So he began to confess. At first, the confessions were small and vague. He hinted at involvement without offering details. Then they grew darker. Holmes described murders with chilling calm, as if he were reciting facts from a textbook. He spoke of rooms, methods, and victims, but each confession contradicted the last. Numbers changed. Names disappeared. Locations shifted. No one could tell when he was telling the truth. And that was exactly what he wanted. Holmes used his confessions as weapons. He fed the press shocking details to keep himself in the spotlight. Newspapers printed his words across front pages, calling him a monster, a devil, a genius of evil. The public was horrified, yet fascinated. Crowds gathered outside the jail just to catch a glimpse of him. Holmes thrived on it. Behind the scenes, investigators struggled. Every new confession sent them chasing fresh leads, many of which led nowhere. Holmes enjoyed watching authorities waste time and resources following stories he had invented. Even in chains, he felt powerful. When the investigation turned fully toward Chicago, the tone changed. Officers searched the building Holmes had designed so carefully. What they found stunned even the most experienced detectives. Hidden rooms, secret passages, sealed doors, evidence of chemical use and human remains. The rumors surrounding the building were no longer whispers. They were facts. Holmes was charged with murder. The trial was unlike anything America had seen before. The courtroom was packed every day. People traveled from distant cities just to witness it. Holmes entered calmly, dressed neatly, his expression relaxed. He listened as prosecutors described his crimes, his methods, and the suffering he caused. He showed no emotion. Witnesses testified about loved ones who vanished after meeting Holmes. Former employees described strange orders and locked rooms. Experts explained how bodies could be destroyed in the ways Holmes was accused of using. The evidence painted a picture of deliberate, calculated evil. Holmes responded with smiles and quiet observations. When it was his turn to speak, he did not beg for mercy. He did not apologize. Instead, he spoke about himself, his intelligence, his uniqueness. He claimed that if he had committed these acts, it was because he was born different. He described himself as a man with no conscience, no remorse, as if that made him special rather than horrifying. At times, he claimed innocence. At other times, he admitted guilt with disturbing pride. The contradictions confused many, but the jury saw through the performance. Holmes was found guilty, sentenced to death. Even then, he refused to let go of control. In the days leading up to his execution, Holmes continued granting interviews. He told reporters he was possessed by an evil spirit. He claimed to feel no pain, no fay. He spoke of death as if it were an inconvenience rather than a consequence. He seemed almost bored by the idea of dying. One request stood out above all others. Holmes demanded that his coffin be filled with concrete and buried deep in the ground. He said he feared grave robbers would steal his body and experiment on it, just as he had done to others. It was the first time he expressed fear. Not of justice, not of death, but of losing control. On the day of his execution, Holmes walked to the gallows without resistance. Witnesses noted his calm demeanor. There were no last-minute confessions, no pleas for forgiveness. When the trapdoor opened, the drop failed to break his neck. Instead, he slowly strangled. For several minutes, his body struggled while the crowd watched in silence. Some later said it felt like justice delayed, forcing him to experience a fraction of the fear he had caused others. Others turned away, unable to watch. When it was over, Holmes was pronounced dead. But even death did not bring clarity. How many people had he really killed? Holmes had claimed dozens. Some believed the number was far higher. Records were incomplete. Bodies were destroyed. Identities lost. The truth was buried alongside him, sealed in concrete. As the crowds dispersed and the headlines faded, one thing remained clear. Holmes had not been caught because he confessed. He had been caught because systems he believed he controlled finally worked against him. The man who lived by lies died surrounded by them, and the silence he left behind was filled with unanswered questions that would haunt the country for generations. After the execution of H. Holmes, many believed the nightmare had finally ended. The man was gone. The court had spoken. Justice, at least in its legal form, had been delivered. Yet the story refused to stay buried. Instead of fading into history, Holmes seemed to grow larger in death, his shadow stretching far beyond the gallows and into the imagination of a shaken nation. The building in Chicago was left standing, silent and abandoned. Without Holmes' presence, it felt different, as if the walls themselves had been holding their breath. Locals avoided the place. Parents warned their children not to walk near it. Some claimed they heard noises at night, though no one lived inside. Others said lights flickered in empty windows. Whether these stories were true or born from fear no longer mattered. The building had become a symbol, not just of murder, but of how easily evil could hide in plain sight. Eventually, a fire broke out inside the structure. Flames tore through the upper floors, consuming rooms that had once hidden terrible secrets. Some said it was an accident. Others whispered that someone had set the fire deliberately, hoping to erase what remained of Holmes' legacy. When the smoke cleared, much of the building was destroyed. Whatever evidence had survived investigation was now lost forever. With the building gone, investigators faced a painful reality. There would be no final answers. Records from the time were incomplete. Many of Holmes' victims had arrived in Chicago under false names or without family. Others were never reported missing. Holmes himself had lied so often that separating truth from fiction became nearly impossible. Every confession he made had been tangled in exaggeration, contradiction, and manipulation. He had turned uncertainty into his final weapon. Historians debated the number of victims endlessly. Some believed Holmes killed a few dozen. Others believed the number could be far higher. The truth sat somewhere in the silence between missing names and unmarked graves. Each unknown victim represented a life erased not only by Holmes, but by a system that had failed to notice their disappearance. As years passed, Holmes became something more than a criminal. He became a story people told to explain fear. Newspapers continued to publish articles about him long after his death. Books were written. Lectures were given. His name became shorthand for deception, cruelty, and manipulation. He was no longer just a man. He was a warning. What made Holmes especially terrifying was not his violence alone. It was how ordinary he seemed. He did not lurk in dark alleys or act with visible madness. He wore clean clothes. He spoke politely. He smiled. He succeeded in business. He was trusted by doctors, bankers, and city officials. He understood how much people relied on appearances and how rarely they questioned those who seemed confident and intelligent. Holmes exploited a growing world. Cities were expanding faster than laws could adapt. People moved often, changed names, and vanished without leaving trails. Institutions trusted paperwork more than people. Holmes understood this weakness and built his crimes around it. He hid behind contracts, signatures, and official stamps, knowing that authority often went unchallenged. The murder castle, even in ruins, became the most chilling symbol of that understanding. It was not a place built in secrecy, hidden from society. It stood openly on a busy street. People walked past it every day. They entered willingly. They trusted what they saw, not what they could not. In later years, experts tried to explain Holmes through psychology. Some called him a psychopath. Others labeled him a narcissist driven by ego and control. While these terms offered explanations, they did not provide comfort. Labels did not bring back the dead. They did not explain how someone like Holmes could operate for so long without intervention. Perhaps the most unsettling truth was that Holmes did not rely on brilliance alone. He relied on silence, on politeness, on the unwillingness of people to ask difficult questions. Neighbors noticed strange things but dismissed them. Employees sensed unease but needed work. Authorities trusted credentials without verifying them. Holmes slipped through gaps created by human hesitation. His story forced the nation to confront uncomfortable truths. That evil does not always announce itself. That danger does not always look dangerous. And that trust, while necessary, can be exploited with devastating consequences. Over time, Chicago rebuilt again. New buildings rose where the murder castle once stood. Streets changed. Businesses came and went. To many, Holmes became a distant historical figure, something learned in books or documentaries. Yet his legacy lingered beneath the surface. Every case involving a charming criminal, every story of betrayal hidden behind a smile, echoed Holmes' methods. Law enforcement learned from his crimes. Insurance policies changed. Missing persons investigations improved. Systems that Holmes had manipulated were slowly strengthened, shaped by the damage he caused. Still, no system is perfect. Holmes' greatest crime may not have been the murders themselves, but the realization he left behind. That one person, armed with intelligence and cruelty, could exploit trust on such a massive scale. That progress and civilization do not automatically protect against darkness, and that monsters do not always hide in the shadows. Sometimes, they build businesses. In the end, H. Holmes did not vanish as he had planned for so many others. He became remembered, studied, and feared. Yet even in memory, he retained a form of control. His lies blurred facts. His confessions confused timelines. His story resisted a clean ending. Perhaps that is the final horror of the case. Not knowing who walked into his building and never returned. Not knowing whose names were lost forever. Not knowing how many lives were cut short by a man who viewed human beings as tools. The case of H. Holmes remains open in the only way that matters. In the minds of those who hear his story and wonder how it was possible. In the silence left behind by unanswered questions. And in the uneasy understanding that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones who look just like everyone else. That is why, more than a century later, the story of America's first serial killer refuses to die.